Écoutez, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci bien d'être là pour cette nouvelle conférence de l'Institut Veolia sur un thème qui est important, celui de la sobriété. Un thème important au regard du nombre d'inscrits, théoriquement 150 dans cette salle, plus une centaine en visioconférence, que je salue aussi. Et puis important aussi, compte tenu de tout ce qu'on attend de la sobriété, à savoir ni plus ni moins que de nous préserver de la pénurie des ressources et de nous sauver du réchauffement climatique. Alors, avoir assez, mais ne pas avoir trop, telle pourrait être une des définitions de la sobriété. La sobriété, c'est la retenue, la modération, l'absence d'excès, et donc la limitation des désirs et des besoins. En réduisant nos consommations, la sobriété réduit évidemment les prélèvements dans la nature, ce qui est une bonne chose, et elle réduit également les pollutions rejetées dans celle-ci, ce qui est une nouvelle bonne chose. La sobriété prend sa racine dans la tempérance et renvoie aux vertus antiques qui, chez les Grecs, avaient pour objectif de mener à la vie bonne et donc au bonheur. Dans son traité d'éthique, qu'il adresse à son fils Nicomaque, Aristote promeut longuement la tempérance et l'équilibre dans l'usage des biens. Et ici, des membres du comité d'éthique de Veolia qui pourront vous le confirmer. La sobriété n'est pas la décroissance. La première n'implique pas forcément une contraction du PIB, la seconde si. Au demeurant, si l'on veut vraiment faire face aux défis écologiques de l'humanité, ce n'est pas la décroissance de l'économie qui importe d'abord, mais c'est celle des flux physiques, à savoir des prélèvements de matières premières dans la nature, de l'énergie, de l'eau. Comme beaucoup de concepts, la sobriété se part de nombreuses nuances, sobriété forte ou sobriété faible, sobriété incitative ou sobriété punitive, sobriété choisie ou sobriété subie. Sobriété énergétique, c'est celle dont on parle souvent le plus, mais il y a d'autres sobriétés, la sobriété hydrique, la sobriété matérielle, et puis aussi la sobriété foncière pour contenir l'artificialisation des sols. Longtemps, la sobriété a été imposée par l'insuffisance de la production de biens et puis la cherté de ceux-ci. Mais dans le tournant des années 1950, avec la production de masse, un tournant est survenu dans les pays développés et consommer devient une pratique socialement valorisée, signe de réussite et de succès et de confort. Inversement, par contre-coup, le réemploi, le recyclage, la sobriété furent associés aux mauvais souvenirs de la Seconde Guerre mondiale ou bien à l'échec économique. J'en viens à la question qui nous intéresse tous. Est-ce que Homo sapiens va redevenir
Homo sobrius, Homo sufficiency? We'll need time to do that, because for a while now, European countries have been calling for sufficiency. In the US, which is a paradise of the consumer world, sufficiency is almost a four-letter word. It's at the foundation of our economic model: hyperproduction, superproduction, and waste. The habits of many sectors are very far from sobriety. Just to remind you, Zara had 52 collections a year. So to be sober is difficult in a society that constantly is calling for more and more consumption, and worldwide hundreds of thousands of people are frugal by need, and they just want to do one thing: to get out of sobriety, forced sufficiency. But sufficiency is something we can reach. We had an example in the winter 22 to 23. 2022 to 23, we reduced our energy consumption very fast. This shows the limitations of sufficiency or sobriety. In developed country, we only are sufficient when we have crises, because of the increase of gas prices, because of the Ukraine war, or the water shortages in the past few years that have led to there being hosepipe bans all over Europe. There's many crises that led to sobriety, like the COVID crisis, which highlighted the sovereignty of countries by reducing importations of raw materials and production. Moreover, a sober society is more resilient too. So, how can we go from consumption to temperance? We need to act at several levels. At the level of individuals, firstly. That's probably the easiest, but it's a least efficient modification of the individual behaviours in Europe could allow us to reduce the carbon footprint of every European citizen by 25%. Why no more than a quarter? Because our behaviours actually depend on us. They are managed by education, social context, regulations and prices, but they're also governed by infrastructures, urban planning and how work is organised. How can we live without a car when land use policies, public transport and spatial distribution of housing and jobs make it impossible? Frugal behaviours can only emerge where reliable and affordable options exist. This is why we need attractive policies that give value to frugality. It's not something that's very seductive. So we need to change the image of frugality, sobriety, present it not as a constraint due to our finite natural resources, but a new social ideal. Technological progress moves faster than frugality or sobriety. Once there's been a relevant innovation, it quickly is disseminated because it doesn't demand any sacrifices. Managing demand is prepared upstream in people's mindsets by questioning our needs, limiting them to what is sufficient. Frugality is at the source, and it demands a very strong personal commitment, and it demands many sacrifices. We cannot ask all of humanity to become virtuous. So does this imply that we have to go for sufficiency through imposing it through unpopular laws, taxes, quotas and norms? To an extent it does, because voluntary changes in behaviours will not have enough impact. Undeniably, sufficiency is one manifestation of responsible management, but on its own it won't be enough. There are other levers we need to use: efficiency in the use of resources and a circular economy, for example. We cannot hope to tackle the massive ecological challenges we face by opposing sufficiency and efficiency, by hampering technological innovations, and by failing to use every available solution. The social and political challenges of sobriety are in the new edition of the Veolia Institute review. You can download it on our website as well. It was coordinated by David Ménaché and Iris Lévy and Archie Penonco. I'd like to thank them for the quality of their work. We are very lucky to be able to welcome several esteemed speakers who will share their expertise, and I would like to thank them from the bottom of my heart. David Ménaché is the founder and director of Archipel, and he also is graduate from HEC. He will be the animator of this conference. I'd like to remind you that Gandhi was actually one of the forerunners in this sobriety, frugality, sufficiency approach. But we'd like to know if David could tell us if in HEC we are taught the principles of frugality and sobriety and sufficiency. Thank you. Thank you. C'était en mute. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nicolas, for this introduction and this very difficult, delicate question on teaching at HEC. I'll answer that at the end of the conference. I'm delighted to be here with you all to talk about sufficiency and frugality and to talk with our esteemed guest. As Nicolas said, this matter of frugality opens many fields of study. And I'd like us to look at these areas in more details with our guests and talk about them with us all. 4 areas today, or right now, but we will obviously be able to talk about other topics. But these are 4 matters that are in echo of what Nicolas said in his introduction. So defining frugality or sobriety, it can be attacked, given many definitions. And this is why we want to talk about the different forms of sobriety, to define them. Nicolas mentioned several kinds of frugality, sufficiency, but I'd like us to leave the surface definition of these words, sobriety, sufficiency. Secondly, what does sufficiency mean exactly? We'll see this with industrial examples and smaller scale examples. How, on a daily basis, do companies or organizations implement actions linked to sufficiency? And it's very important that we think of the challenges, and it's very important that we understand very concrete applications. And as Nicolas mentioned, there's the matter of responsibility and articulating individual responsibilities, responsibility of corporations, states, or the normative powers, and also our global imagination, our culture, in other words. This third point is one of the points we mentioned, and considering how urgent the situation is, because Nicolas was quite clear in his introduction. Sufficient is meant to allow us to save resources, but also fight climate change. How to scale this up? What economic models can allow us to change the scale? It's people's mindset and mechanisms to scale this all up. There's a matter of definitions, applications, responsibilities, and changing the scale. So these are the questions. 4 major questions. So to talk about these 4 topics, I'm going to facilitate this roundtable with our 4 guests. So we first have Lucile Schmid, co-founder and vice president of La Fabrique écologique, a think tank. We'll go into these matters of definition and explain the trends of sobriety. There are other international trends. Then we have Stéphanie Calvino, the founder of the Anti-Fashion Project. So intuitively, there are sectors we don't think of when we think of fashion. What is sufficiency in the world of fashion? In the world of fashion, Xavier Brisbois, he's a researcher. He's a doctor in psychology and independent researcher. What's the individual's responsibility? How can they change their behavior? And finally, Chevauché, who's a director of the circular economy in Veolia. What is sufficiency for Veolia? What can Veolia do in terms of sufficiency? And when we think of these external trends that contribute to turning an actor like Veolia into a sufficient economic actor, so we'll have a very short hour together, and then we'll give you the floor for question. I'm going to start with Lucile Schmid. Thank you, Lucile, for being here today. You are the co-founder and vice president of La Fabrique écologique, a think tank. Nicolas said, well, sufficiency has many definitions. So that's a question in the introduction. Firstly, lots of words are attached to sufficiency: intense, forced, voluntary, forced, weak, and so forth, imposed. Could you tell us about these different concepts? And sobriety is a word that can't be translated into other languages, really. So why is sufficiency or sobriety or frugality, something that finds an echo in the French ecosystem. What's the relationship between sobriety and other words like frugality and sufficiency? Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm afraid I've got the light in my eyes, but I'd like to answer all your questions, which are quite fascinating. Thank you, David. I listened to Nicolas just now, and I was thinking there's one thing that's quite interesting. The more adjectives you add to the word sobriety, the more you wonder about the relationship between words and action, which is crucial for ecological matters, because nowadays there are so many words, teeming words: sobriety, energy efficiency, policies, activism, and so on and so forth. So all these words cannot be attached to actions that easily. Sometimes it's quite difficult to attach it to actions. Sometimes the very definition, the shared definition that will develop on sobriety, we need to attach the word to actions and not overqualify it all the time: supported, chosen, north, south, and so on and so forth. That's a first, it's crucial point if we do not want to get things wrong, if we don't want anyone to avoid their responsibility. Secondly, we went back to the antique times, ancient history, and we moved to the 21st century. And there's a matter of a permanent credibility of this word sobriety over the century, because until the 19th century, sobriety was something that was quite natural, because we were in a world where resources were scarce, and that was just part of everyday life, and it was part of states' life. So there was conquest and research of resources, but we were in a world where this issue of finite resources was very much there. And then we forgot this idea of finite resources from the Industrial Revolution on, and you talked about the 1950s on. And I think that other researchers like François Jarich, who's a historian, he says it's actually due to the Industrial Revolution that we lost that the idea of prosperity became something quite automatic. So we're in a situation where thinking of sobriety in an abundant society is more complicated than thinking of sobriety in a society where there are shortages. But we are also in a world that is not fair, that is not equal. And we have societies where we have shortages and societies where we have everything we need. And this matter of a north and south. There's an economist, Mr. Jenny Ferry, who said in the 21st century we are in a situation where the economy of shortages comes back full strength. There's issues with our production of textile and our consumption habits, but we're faced with a situation of shortages for some resources for the next 50 years on. And with the Ukraine war, there was all of a sudden this eruption of gas shortages. So we are changing our economic mindsets. We're going from a society of consumption and economic actors who continue amplifying this consumption mechanism. We say we are on this volcano and we are reaching shortages all of a sudden. So this is a very unique moment in time. And the third point, which I think is very important, is the fact that the IPCC, the experts group on climate issues that's made up of thousands of scientists from the world over, and wrote a report in 2022, and they actually said that they'd give a definition of sobriety. I can't actually remind it off by heart. I'm going to read it to you. It's linked to these different issues that show that sobriety cannot be seen and defined outside of a new social and economic model. So what's the definition that was given by the IPCC in 22? It's a researcher, Yasmina Saeb, who played a crucial part in it. So let's take a look at what she says. The IPCC says sobriety is a series of measures and practices carried out on a daily basis. It's something very concrete that avoids use of energy, raw materials, and water. So that's the whole qualification of land resources whilst ensuring the well-being of everyone. So this is at the planetary level, the northern and south hemispheres, of course, like is the case with the northern hemisphere countries with the matters of social inequalities in the respect of our planet. So there are three kinds of things that are being said, that are interacting. planetary limits, well-being, and, of course, daily practices ensuring economies of resources.
All of this is highly complex and not very conceptual, but you get the feeling that to break down all of these arguments into operations, well, we're coming up against a wall because planetary limits in our current economic and social functionings, well, we're a far cry from that. Ensuring well-being for all, we're also very far from that. And just imagine on a daily basis, if we practice a form of economy, well, that's not part of people's habits today. Not in companies, not in individuals, not in governments. So this IPCC definition is interesting because it got debate up again around sobriety, but it's very far from providing anything operational. But what is useful is that scientists and researchers are now becoming involved and saying we have to find a new paradigm for public policy. So this is not a Stoics definition, because there's the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Epicureans were thinking about what sobriety would be. Well, it's somewhere in between having a collective governmental responsibility, and I think that's essential. Thank you very much for providing this framework, which sheds a lot of light on the question. So this issue of the word itself, sobriety, and how difficult it is to translate. And that's why we have a chapter in these facts on translation. So, and this is something that's significant. I mean, how do we translate sobriety into English, which was sufficiency? And is this significant, the fact that sobriety has particular meaning in French culture? And for you, and this is something Nicolas mentioned, this broadcasting of this, a culture of sobriety within Anglo-American culture, but also emerging countries where their aspirations are different. Well, I think what's interesting about the definition by the IPCC that I just gave, it's a number of words with a very explicit description, because there is no exact word for this concept. And IPCC, of course, works mostly in English. So sufficiency and frugality, none of this really has the same resonance and the broadness as the term sobriety in French. Sobriété. And in French, so we took the risk of introducing this notion of sobriety in the legal register. So it's part of the definition of the ecological transition. But this is not the case in the US. But there was a lot of debate between the Germans and the French in Europe in introducing this notion of sobriety, because the Germans said to the French, well, no, we just need efficiency, and efficiency in the energy sector, and that's it. But Agnès Pannier-Runacher, when she was the Minister of Energy in France, wanted to introduce this idea of sobriety to make it a benchmark for the entire European project, on the basis that it would be a way of backing the Green Deal up against something which is more of a roadmap to describe what sobriety is. Preserving biodiversity is another form of sobriety. But France was not followed in this. And what's interesting to note is that there might be philosophical terms. A philosophical discussion is different from one between lawyers. Jurists won't have the same discussion as MPs or as governments. So it's important to see what the references are, what's covered by this notion of sobriety, and to go beyond a philosophical discussion, even though a philosophical discussion can lead to cultural transformation. Obviously, this is something we need. Now, I don't really like referring to popular imagination, because that's something that's too theatrical or too romantic. People's imaginaries, well, we need something much more technical. The issue is, how can we break this down into a social model and to make it a symbol of success, of somebody having succeeded in life? people's wages, for example, are used to measure their success, but this should also be. But let me ask you one last question. If you could shed some light on the distinction that you make or not between sobriety and degrowth. Well, yes, this is something that Nicolas didn't want to mention, degrowth, but at HEC, Timothée de Paris, who said renounce or perish, no, slow down or perish. It was a very successful book, and you can see that younger generations, including those who do wish to succeed in life by having very, very high salaries, well, décroissance in French or degrowth in English is something that's in complete opposition to this. So if you want sobriety in a number of sectors, well, they'll have to have degrowth, even though it's a dirty word. But in political discourse, Elisabeth Borne, when she talked about sobriety in 2022, in terms of energy sobriety, and there was a drop in 11% of energy consumption in France, as well as at the European level. But she also said sobriety is not degrowth. So basically, you're repeating the words of Elisabeth Borne. And in a world of decision makers, or people working alongside decision makers, they know perfectly well that sobriety is not degrowth. I think we should be much more open to come back to the definition by the IPCC. If we want to take into account planetary boundaries, well, there will have to be a reduction in growth in a number of sectors, but that can still ensure the well-being of all. Degrowth doesn't necessarily mean a lack of well-being. And so the relations between global north and global south, there's never been a question of sobriety or degrowth. When Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, in his speeches, he never talks about this, but in the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree or 2 degree scenario by 2100, we do need degrowth. But whenever we need to take action, it's important to avoid it because sobriety and degrowth are things that need to be implemented to a given degree, but backed on social and economic objectives. And I think if these words are mentioned in talks between North and South, between civil society and governments, sobriety and degrowth are words that are scary. But if we want to make progress, we do have to consider a form of degrowth in some sectors. Earlier, I mentioned the ad campaign by the ADEME. And there was somebody who was de-selling something. And a lot of small merchants reacted. And the Minister of the Economy had to say that it hadn't been approved by the Minister of the Economy. So there will be controversy around this topic of sobriety, but we nonetheless do have to find ways to act rather than talking about unfortunate sobriety or... Thank you very much. Yeah, you talked about to think and to act, and this brings us to a specific sector which would not appear very sober at first glance. You talked about Zara with their 52 collections per year. And I would also like to say that we are Rue Madeleine Vionnier, and she was a seamstress. That's something I just learned when I was preparing this. So it's interesting to talk about fashion today. Thank you very much, Stéphanie Calvino, for being here with us. So you, about 10 years ago, you created an organization with a slightly controversial concept, which is called anti-fashion. At least it's very clear. And your goal was to apply, I don't know if you used the term sobriety back then, but to reform fashion and to think more about the impact. And could you present what anti-fashion is, why you created this project, what were your initial convictions, have those changed today, and what anti-fashion does? Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. So very quickly, anti-fashion doesn't make everybody smile. At the beginning, some were quite upset. But it's actually a manifesto written by Liedewald Elkort. And she's someone who will say, okay, in 5 years, we'll all be eating organic food in electric cars and we'll live in a wooden house. So she's a futurist, and she talks about what's going to happen 10 years from now. So she's very good at imagining what might happen for the automobile sector or fashion, phones, etc. So she wrote this manifesto. So she doesn't talk about sobriety. It's never used, but she does say that in the fashion industry, there are a lot of things that no longer work. So she lists 10 points, and it was published in 2015. At the time, I was working for the Maison de la Mode in Marseille and the prêt-à-porter sector in Paris, and I was quite sick of a model that was no longer working because designers had to produce non-stop, produce textiles, and this is still the case. They have to organize salons, they have to sell. But at the end of the day, they're still in difficulty. So I found this woman's email address, and I sent her an email to say maybe we should organize a conference in Marseille, that's where I was at the time, to try to bring together all actors who have been thinking about fashion differently. There were very few at the time. There still aren't very many. So we organized a conference over 2.5 days to show economic models. We still didn't mention the word sobriety, even though the principles were being applied. So there's Patagonia, Freitag, for example, are some companies that are an example of this, but there are only about a dozen whose economic model is very basic, and they don't think in terms of growth. Beja, for example, they use natural rubber that they get from the rubber trees in Brazil, and they do it every 6 months so that the tree can regenerate the matter, that it can be harvested again. And yes, this does have an impact on the number of sneakers they can produce. You have to wait for the rubber tree to grow back. You can't make as many shoes as you want. You have to respect what nature is able to give. So the conference was quite a success. That was in 2016. And we imagined that fashion could also be a vector for insertion with a social dimension, which hadn't been the case up until now, because fashion was always a way of forecasting what would happen in society. But then about 10 years ago, this began to stagnate. Some say that it's either the number 1 polluter or the number 2 polluter in terms of industry. Fashion is extremely polluting and not at all looking to sobriety. As Nicolas was saying, their goal is always to produce more. I mean, Zara, with 52 collections a year, that's a new collection every week. So every week in the stores at Zara, H&M, they get new collections that flood the stores. The sales staff drown in clothes. And then clients coming to the store are either frustrated because they don't find what they need. And there's a whole psychological mindset. People wanting something that's new because they think they're going to be happier if their clothes are new. But probably not a good way of going about it. And those who don't have the means to buy the clothes are very frustrated. So based on that, we said to ourselves, okay, why don't we use fashion, or this fashion industry, for social insertion. So we created a mentoring project for people from underserved neighborhoods. We started in Marseille, and currently we're also setting up a project in Roubaix, which is the 3rd poorest city in France, with unemployment levels between 30% and 50%. So we set up a program to try to raise awareness amongst young people who have no particular skills, who are out of school, who are neat, basically. And we try to raise awareness and to make them more conscious of fashion. And we have upskilling workshops. So these people are already sober in their daily lives because their main goal is to have enough to eat and a place to sleep. And then we look for surplus, but that's only in the second phase. So the way they dress, the way they live is fully sober. And okay, sobriety isn't all that sexy, and it can be felt as an imposition, but we try to make these young people understand that can actually be a talent, and then in making a treasure out of waste is an incredible skill. So we try to make them realize that they have much more agency than they think. Very often they have very little vision over any type of work they might do. They don't have enough information. So this is a way of getting them motivated and getting them to in a position where they can look for a job. And sobriety, for me, is a real strength. Using everything you have is an amazing skill. But it's not necessarily easy. So we teach them a number of things. We try to raise their awareness, and we accompany them in choosing training or a profession that is of their own choosing. And all of this, of course, has an impact. So when we organize our upcycling or sewing workshops, to make a t-shirt. So upcycling, you take a sweatshirt and you make a pillow out of it, for example. So you transform something and you give it a new life in a new form. So when you set them in front of a sewing machine and you train them to make a t-shirt, and they see that it takes them between 14 and 20 minutes to make a t-shirt, but it's actually a lot. In the French industry, in the very few workshops, each t-shirt, each minute is worth about €0.50. So t-shirts, well, the cost is between 7 and 10 euros when it comes out of the factory. Then there's the distribution and all of that. So when you buy a t-shirt for €3, well, mathematically that's impossible. A lot of the chains are missing. So when you set a kid behind a sewing machine, you say, okay, create clothing. They think, okay, if you buy Shein, Zara, or H&M at these prices, there's something wrong. It means that there's going to be an impact elsewhere. And very often, countries in Asia and the global south, Africa is becoming a primary producer of textile because the labor force is very cheap there. And so, of course, this has an impact, and it's not good for the planet, and it's not good for humans. So I talked about the workshops we set up. We also have writing workshops. You might think this has nothing to do with fashion, but that's actually not the point. We don't really care. Fashion is just a way of going about it to get them interested. Saying, there's some things you cannot buy at a certain price. And it all depends on your values. We've lost the sense of value today. Same thing for travel. People buy plane tickets on Ryanair, with low-cost companies and others, and people don't realize value anymore because when you're just accumulating everything all the time, and this is definitely not sober behavior, but I know it's going to take a very long time and a lot of work to get back to a sober mentality. It's going to take a complete upheaval, but it's all around the values. And that's been replaced by just accumulating merchandise and traveling. We've created a mountain of need. And we've come very far from this model of sobriety, which we had, for example, after the Second World War. So let me ask you one more question, and please a brief answer. What's your view of the capacity of people working in the fashion sector to change? So I'm sure you interact with this industry, and what do you think their capacity is to integrate this notion of sobriety? Well, it's very small. Currently, we work a lot with people in the sector, but they're really not even a dozen have really changed their economic model. And because their companies are not set up to only produce growth. And I really think people shouldn't be scared of this concept of degrowth. It's possible to have a viable company and produce less. It's all about values. If you sell a t-shirt for 30 euros rather than 10, you sell fewer, maybe, but you will still generate profits. So amongst those that pollute the most, what's complicated today is that we're being flooded. The Shein, Temu, we're flooded with stuff, and people are rushing around buying because they bought a magazine that tells them what to buy. And so people are being conditioned by the press, by media, to buy nonstop. And of course, on the other end is a company that's pushing their product. And in schools, there are very few schools today thinking along these lines, very few training their students to think along more sober lines. Thank you very much. Not a very optimistic response, but probably very lucid as to the world of fashion. So you talked about consumers, and this brings me to you, Xavier. So you are a researcher at the Ville Mobilité Transport Laboratory. You work a lot about changes in behavior, behavioral psychology. So maybe a very broad question, which is how can you mobilize the end user? Because it's the end users who want to buy things. So how can we try to change the behavior of the end users, consumers, citizens? And what's the importance of this lever? So 2 questions. The importance of these levers and how does it work? Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I won't answer directly. I would like to begin by saying that it's very difficult to know exactly what to do and how to go about it, and to pull away from people who want to just set things up saying, okay, all will be well. And how do you really get to where it is you want to go? But where it is we want to go is that all of the individuals that we are, and through each and every one of our choices, I want people to be aware that there's a problem. And for this, you need to reach a huge number of people with a huge number of very small behaviors that they don't see as problematic. But, okay, we haven't reached this stage yet, but we are still playing golf. But the whole difficulty is to address each and every individual and to get them to change their own behavior. And they don't always have the capacity to act. But I think individuals come last. This is an example I like because when you try to think about other people's behaviors, we all often have a lot of biases. But when you study this and you take a stance where you're not trying to look at Homo sapiens, but rather an organism that's trying to survive and that reproduces, then you develop a behavioral approach And what determines people's behavior is actually the context they're in. And this is the context we're in. This is the widest highway in the world. Well, so 26 lanes. And it's funny, well, not exactly funny, but it's interesting for two reasons. First of all, it shows the opposite of sobriety. Sobriety, basically. And what's amusing here is that 14 years ago, it was only 16 lanes wide, and there are a lot of traffic jams, so they spent billions increasing the number of lanes, and now they have twice as many traffic jams. And so they're going to extend it again, and the traffic jams will increase again. And we know that this happens. But the individuals who live here around Houston, we say, okay, no, actually, okay, you are going to ride your bike. It's going to be difficult. In Texas, they're not very amenable to that. But it's important to understand. So we have this idea of humans making rational decisions because they're thinking about their own interests and they optimize their decision. But actually, this isn't something that actually works because that's not how humans think, actually. We basically try to save our own time. And our decisions are based on what we're paying attention to and not anything rational. And this, well, I think, so practices around a red light, where often you have pedestrians. And so to look at the number of people who cross when the light's red. 16% cross when it's red. That's not all of us, or a lot of, so if there's a red light at midnight. But what the research says, okay, I'm going to be the first one. I'm going to pave the way, and I'm going to do it. So he does it a lot, quite neutrally. And so that's the average status. And then they do it again, wearing a three-piece suit. And here, 54% of the people waiting at the red light who crossed because he did. So with this higher status. So to check this, he dressed as a homeless person, and only 9% of people followed him. So if there's one thing that's a determining factor, well, it's actually other people. And we spend a lot of time worrying about other people, what kind of group we're in, what our status is. And I think there's a lot that could be done along these social dynamics to organize change. You talked about inequality and our capacity to share all of this and what we do in society, but we have to manage to reach individuals as they are in their social life. So I'm not going to give you an example right away, but we do have this problem of representing others and the image people have of others. And we do tend to base ourselves on ideas which are often things which are social constructs. This idea that you have to have a big house with a shower with a certain flow. It's not obviously important. There has to be a whole social construct around it. And then inversely, it's important to have other representations. So let's imagine the industry, the German rail industry, Deutsche Bahn. There's a campaign to encourage people to take the train that shows, I don't know if you can see the text, at the left it's Arizona, 1,100 euros, and then to the right, Rhineland, Germany, 24 euros. And well, then they say, okay, well, actually, why do people travel? Why are they going there? And so then at the bottom, so it's about 10 photos. And the idea each time is that ideas are all around, people's ideas around it. It's always 24, I guess they had a special fare, 24 euros. So saying you could go to exotic and wonderful places that aren't far away. You don't need to go across the world to find something interesting. So in these representations, here we have other topics. To the bottom left, there's a website that lists all the ways that people have bicycle. Okay, you do need a little trailer in the back, but you don't necessarily need a car to move. A lot of people can do without one. So you can't imagine what this woman is doing. It looks pretty dangerous, so threading through the cars, but it can be done. So, okay, maybe we need to be guided, but it's not enough to have a positive representation to make change, but you do have to start there. And so I think we still need to represent certain things positively. And this idea of sobriety, at least people now know it's possible and does have value.
There's still a lot of controversy, more than the statement of something. It's still too theoretical and too far from good practices. Practices, well, in practice, there's more cars than bikes, as we can see on a picture. And what about the importance of individual change? Just to, well, go back to what Nicolas said in the introduction. What's the importance of individual change? They often say only talk about individuals who need to change. No. Now, I'd say there's this sort of triangle: the citizen, a worker, consumer, and so on. Worker, they must act at their level. For politicians, policy developers take this into account for their offer, so that they know that people are interested and will react positively. And then industry thinks, okay, well, there's demand for bikes, let's manufacture new bikes, and so on and so forth. That's one of the consequences. So for this to change, everyone needs to take part. Is it just started? Is it just politicians who need to start? Does the industry have to start? Everyone needs to move things around. I think it's good to say that it goes by stages. One thing is, it's easier to start by yourself. I think I know it's possible to change, but I can't. If my demand is not heard, well, I see it's pointless to change my behaviour because it doesn't change a thing. But if my changes are noticed, well, it has a positive impact as well. It's virtuous circles. We can't ask politicians to not be elected because they've got a super green program that no one votes for. No, it needs to be progressive. It needs to be circular. And the role of each and every one of these actors in this triangle to be listened. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Catherine. Catherine, you're the director for circular economy in Veolia. You say there's a moment for every actor. Is it the time for industry to start doing things, for actors like Veolia to start implementing these sufficiency matters? What is the point of acting? This is a huge question. Economic models. What do economic models mean for an actor like Veolia? And there's also the matter of wanting to know what you think on these new constraints on an actor like you, not just Veolia, the changes in the norms that regulate us. So what is your perception on a change in these norms and regulations? Has the time come? Yes, the time has come. To go back to the triangle we saw right now, it's an ecosystem, basically. We need norms, we need regulations to act, and there are also solo actions we can carry out ourselves because we've decided on a strategy or a policy. So a few examples, simple examples that is, of what Veolia does nowadays. They're not sufficiency as such. They're linked to models, existing businesses, and they all work to doing better with less resources. Here are a few pictures I'm sure that everyone here and online will recognize these pictures. So this is a waste treatment plant, top right. It can produce drinking water, and that creates a real loop. So that's in Namibia. In Namibia, there's a lot of hydric stress, local hydric stress, and local regulations allow for this. There's need for water. And here you can see that the three actors mentioned by the previous speaker is quite clear. Was it tested before the implementation of all this? We don't know, but it exists. It's a solution that exists nowadays. Bottom right now, a picture that illustrates battery recycling. So how we are taking on the scarcity of resources. We're going towards sobriety, yes. How do we take on the idea of having more loops for water? That's the picture in the middle, on the bottom. In France, it's allowed, because there's been changes in regulations, to reuse water for uses that weren't allowed at first. It's actually, well, similar to what is top right in Namibia, in Windhoek, because the use of a total loop of Namibia is not allowed in France yet. But this loops that allow us to identify what can be done with a resource once it's been used, to bring it back into the whole system. Bottom left, plastic pellets, recycled plastic pellets. So we take a resource that we use, and we're going to turn it into a resource that's got all sorts of technical issues associated. And top left, a new model. We're testing it here at Veolia, life to life. A sort of platform. It's our sort of Bon Coin, it's our eBay, Veolia, for Veolia. And a piece of equipment that was used at a given place comes to the end of its life in this plant, but it's not at the end of its life cycle. But we don't need it where we are. This truck, this pump, no longer is what we need, but it could be used in another contract, in another plant. It's all internal to Veolia, yes, but it's got to work. It's going to have to work beyond saying, oh, it allows us to save new purchases, new equipment, and consume new materials and resources. It allows us to save on greenhouse gas emissions, because we're not going to take in, use up new resources, and it means we generate less waste. So this solution seems to work, yes, but it needs to be backed up. We can't just say something works on the shelf. We tested it for a year or 18 months. No, there's a whole governance around this. There's a new way of thinking through our procurement. It's more complicated to go to a platform as defined nowadays, instead of saying, oh, I know the supplier who can replace my pump. He'll be here in 2 days' time, and I need it right now. It's faster than going onto the platform to see if there's the right equipment. How can I bring it over? So there's a whole environment that's going to allow these ecosystems to thrive. But the solution exists. It's not just technical aspects. There's governance and strategy as well. All that needs to be implemented. So these are things that are being done. On these matters of all the other dimensions of governance, what, I don't know how to qualify this. What about external pressure or demand? Are these changes linked to norms or your customers' requests? How do you see this demand / pressure? Several things from the outside. So, oh, we've got one slide missing. Right. Just here, yes. Several things exist outside. Planetary limits. You've got these 9 limits. That's something that an international team of researchers for Stockholm Institute talked about. Climate, water, new molecules that are being thrown back into the water, the air, and the earth, and so on. Biodiversity. We've got these 9 planetary limits, which means that we live in a safe and sustainable environment, and these 9 limits are breaking down. They're deteriorating, but it's not just physical limitations, there's social limitations. How? We've got these social minimum levels. I mean, we can all live decently, properly, which isn't the case right now if you look at things at a macro level. It depends on where you live. How do we stay in these planetary limits, which are physical limits? And how can we make sure there's a minimum level for education, care, access to all sources of services, food, housing, all of which means that we live decently, we have a decent lifestyle. How can we stay within these 2 limits? So for an actor like Veolia, when you talk about the ecological transition we want, where do we fit in this? Lots of things come from the outside. Customers who want us to manage their waste flow with as little incineration as possible, as little storage as possible, the most valuation of waste, reusing of waste, but they've got dangerous or non-dangerous waste. So there's all sorts of issues around materials and data that goes with these materials. There's these customers, and there's also constraints and opportunities. For me, they're more like opportunities than constraints, but there's new regulations, be it at the European level with the increase of eco-conception, designing products better for them to generate less waste, for them to produce less dangerous materials, less chemistry, for example. So there's these regulatory changes. There's also reporting, changes in reporting, to be a bit more transparent on reporting that allows us to say how we can loop the loop better. So there's that. And there's voluntary approaches that we can see on the screen. Or there's pushes. These actions on the circular economy forwards. It can be an alternate way of living. It doesn't reject degrowth. And the word of degrowth was there, yes. So it's an international norm that was published. And we can see what's in the middle of a middle loop, refuse. Whereas over 100 countries around the table who are talking about the norms on a circular economy or an alternate proposals to the current model. We talked about degrowth. It's not something scary. These are activities that'll disappear gradually, and others are going to appear, emerge. I don't know exactly what the time scale is, but it's for sure in the face of a scarcity, increased scarcity of resources, the quality of water worsening, or the molecules that are being emitted into the atmosphere and don't disappear. Well, we see we need to go on a different path, and that's all linked to refusing. One final question before I give you all the floor in the room and online. What's the difference between developed countries and countries in the south? What's your perspective on the changes in the laws and rules and regulations in Europe and what we have in the Southern Hemisphere? This sort of ebriety, love of getting drunk on consumption, consuming, reusing resources. Well, we have these texts that we draft internationally on what the circular economy is and how we can implement this circular economy. We had about 100 countries on this. There were all continents represented. There were countries of the African, Asian, American continents, both North and South America, that is. So around the table, there were different kinds of applications of what the circular economy is, and also different levels of maturity of a circular economy. So for countries in the north, I don't know if we can oppose the global north to the global south, but developed countries, Western countries, have a constraint. They need to rethink and reduce some parts of their activity, of their economy, to get other areas of our activity to grow. And I think this is what's being promoted as not a four-letter word. And then there are countries whose needs are growth. But do you remember the donut I mentioned? We've got a social minima and a planetary limit. We need to try and find something that's going to fit in there. There are countries that need to satisfy the primary needs of the populations, but with techniques and solutions that aren't necessarily the techniques and solutions that we borrowed from industrialized countries. Or when you have a new technology or a new solution, it adds on to others. It doesn't take away from the old ones. We accumulate. It's just like fashion. We accumulate solutions. One doesn't prevent the use of the other. That's why there's this whole explosion from a point of view of the energy consumption, the use of electronic gadgets, and so on and so forth. So there are all sorts of thoughts around this. Everyone wanted to find new models that will be applied differently dependent on a geographic area. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you for what you just said. I'm going to give the floor to the public because our guests have had the opportunity to speak out. So I think it'd be nice to talk this through with you all. We've started opening these 4 chapters. What is sobriety? What are the applications of sufficiency for larger companies and smaller companies? What is the role of the individual? And we're touching upon these matters of putting things to scale. Representations, not ideas. Circular economies, and Le Bon Coin is the link between fashion and activities like Veolia. So, what are your questions? What are your reactions? What are your existential questions? I think there are mics going around the room. So, one thing. Just to tell you, we can't really see you in the room. We don't know if you're smiling or not. We won't get to see your body language, I'm afraid. A question up here. Could someone maybe bring a mic up? Should I bring a mic up? Cyril, should I bring the mic up? Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to start with a question on eco-tax. Lots of behaviors are oriented by financial aspects of things. Nowadays, eco-tax exist. They've existed for a long time now, and I think there's a whole economy built around this. I think that this tax doesn't have much of an impact on us. Could it not be almost counterproductive for us to leave this feeling of guilt because we've paid an eco-tax because it's just €1 per fridge, isn't it? Would it not be better to accelerate our change? In order to accelerate our changes in behaviour, would it not be good to have a higher eco-tax? Could that not help change our behaviours more? I don't know who wants to answer. Yes. Thank you. I think your question on eco-tax is actually interesting when it comes to purchasing, but I'd like to answer to a more global question. What about the greening of tax? How can we use tax to change people's behavior? The first thing that comes to mind is the yellow vest movement in 2018. There was an eco-tax at the European level and the articulation between local issues and social issues for greening tax. Well, we hadn't managed to bring the two together. So increasing the tax, the eco-tax when you buy a fridge would be a possibility. But why not think about how our tax can be modified to take into account the energy transition? Our experience shows that it can't be done without thinking things through first. Take the tax cuts, the subsidizing of energy. You've got people who are very wealthy who buy fuel at the same price for someone who isn't wealthy. So that's an issue. The matter of green taxes, when they're not linked to real social and local questions, it can lead to a real ecological backlash. We're at a stage in our lives where political parties say working on the ecology is increasing social inequality. So what can we do for these taxes to lead to greener behaviours? How can we associate them to a redistribution system that favours social justice? As Jean Canizi-Piferi talked about, implementing a tax on the wealthiest homes, because the burden of transforming, becoming greener, is actually higher when you can't afford it. You can want to be green, but not be able to be green because you can't afford it. So this tax question goes beyond eco-taxes. It creates the idea of social costs. We don't think it's a sensitive issue that should be just in the hands of few. On the contrary, I think everyone should talk about this. Right, my answer now. The impact of price on a decision is very varied. Taxes. Now, fuel, firstly. Generally, we assess the price of traveling by car as 1/3 of what it really is, because we just think of the price of fuel. When you think of cars, travel by car, as we can see with the explosion of SUVs, people don't realize. So, there's this tax on SUVs in Paris, and that was actually good because it makes people realize the real cost of SUVs. Food consumption, people are ready to pay more for recyclable packaging. We've had some experiences on this. People only had two choices, but people would pay for the same product. They'd be agreeing paying more if it was recycling packaging. You can accept to pay more if you think it's good quality. When you tax, there's the tendency to go towards low end. It doesn't always work. So you can't change people's behavior only by talking, only with tax. That's not going to work. Stéphanie, right. It makes me think of other things. How can we have a new model that integrates some performances, be they social or environmental, instead of just looking at the product as such? There's also something we could talk about. We can't decide this by ourselves, but having other ways of counting things to be able to integrate environmental and social performances to give value to something we give no value to. That could be a new way ahead beyond taxation. Maybe it'll lead to more tax, I don't know. Maybe it'll open a new way of thinking, giving value to things we don't give value to, the social and environmental impacts, that is. Financial sanctions aren't a solution. We're not going to teach people things by making things more, because basically those who can afford it will pay. Those who can't won't pay, that's all. So something's been set up for reparation bonus. Before you buy, you wonder if you can repair things. In the past, we used to repair lots of things. We used to repair lots of things, even socks. Nowadays, we just throw something out when it has a hole in it. Nowadays, you can buy everything for nothing. You can buy a fridge for 300, 400 euro. Now, what about buying products for their real value? We'd buy less. There'd be less problem with the mass of production. Taxing and giving a financial cost to buying things, I don't think that's going to work. I'm not convinced. Another question. Yes, next to you, sir. Please ask your question. I can't see you who's speaking. I can't see who's speaking. Nicolas Michel. I work with Catherine on sustainable development. I'd like to quote Aurélien Barraud. As long as we think it's progress to mow down a space that's got a lot of ecological life, to build a supermarket car park, we will never be out of the woods. If we think consumption society gives us goods, consumer society is something positive, we'll never be on a way to a solution. Instead of working on sufficiency to maintain our lifestyles by making minimal changes, we need to think seriously about changing to go to very different lifestyles, because they're better, they're more satisfactory, they're fairer. And these lifestyles are probably more sufficient, more sober. One solution that wasn't mentioned today, there are simple solutions that exist. Moving closer to nature. In the past, 30, 40 years, we moved away from nature. In the past 70 years, that is, we are very far away from nature, and it makes us very unhappy. Maybe it's an idea to get closer to nature, to biodiversity. Maybe it would make us happier, more sober, and lead to destruction, because we only can maintain, conserve, protect what we know. It'll be good for the environment. Okay, a quick answer for me. Yes. We are far disconnected from nature. There are a few policies now, like zero net artificialization, but I think this policy was actually not voted. on policies on how to bring farming back to agriculture, back to the cities. These things can go in the right direction. How to make land more permeable to rain in an urban environment. This reconnect. Veolia permaculture. We had an article on this quite recently for the promotion of permaculture by Veolia in a 14-hectare farm in the north of France. These are reconnects that can allow us to change things a bit. There may be other modifications that will come from where we don't expect them to come. I believe in this. I don't know how many of you agree with this. I think young people will do this. In these underserved neighborhoods we were talking about earlier on, maybe from municipal policies.
So there's an association called Banlieue Climat, which is set up in several different municipalities, Aubervilliers, Saint-Ouen, and Banlieue Climat, or suburbs and climate, is young people between 20 and 30 years old who promote popular education in the environment, in society, and they're extremely active. And it's through groups of this type that things might change. I think we have become disconnected from nature, and we have to reconnect because of the planetary boundary. This is also because we are part of the planet. We are damaging our own selves when we damage the planet. Yes, the Fabrique écologique just published a text that I encourage you to look at if you're interested, on awareness, being attuned to nature. And what I think is interesting here is that this is a text that comes back to the idea of putting awareness of nature at the heart of the educational system, although it's a bit vague, but coming back to classic authors and getting back in touch with nature is something that happens much more often and more spontaneously when you don't live in a big city. So it is important to come back to life, but we need to acquire knowledge, acquire complexity. It's a completely different way of seeing the world. I'm the daughter of a botanist, and I saw my father collect thousands of species. And today, in life and earth sciences, considered a less important subject than math or physics, but there are completely different ways of learning than you do with math and physics. So modeling ourselves more on nature is easy to say, harder to do. And it's hard enough at an individual level, but extremely hard collectively. So I worked a lot on activism so there's a wish to be elsewhere for innovation. And if people want to get closer to nature, how do you go from a minority culture to a majority culture? Individualism, well, each individual could say, okay, no, I'm closer to nature than others. So, but how do we turn this into a social movement? And as you were saying earlier, and I talked with Ernst Barkat, it's interesting to see that it's in these underprivileged neighborhoods where relationships with nature are more complicated. Very often parks are in bourgeois neighborhoods. During the pandemic in 2020, it was more difficult when you didn't have a second home to continue to be able to see a tree. So there's social inequality. Sorry to come back to this, but there are a lot of generalities about individuals, citizens, but we're not equal before biodiversity, before the possibility to reconnect to nature. And public policy that we're implementing and the social contract we're organizing has to be green. This is fundamental. And I would like to end by saying that today in the literature, there seems to be an explosion of inspiration around young authors, the first novels around nature. And it's more in the questions of biodiversity, nature, forest as common goods, oceans as commons. That's things are happening in terms of inspiration, which is highly reassuring, but we're still deteriorating nature. We still see dystopias. So you're completely right. We have to wake up to the urgency to reconnect with life and to protect life from us. Very often, protectors of nature say this is an asymmetrical relationship. And in the debate around preserving nature, the question is, should we preserve certain areas and just exclude humans completely? But it's important to know how to respect nature. That's very important. Any other questions or reactions? So I have the microphone, so I'll go ahead. I'm coming back to this notion of sobriety and social changes. We've talked a lot about sobriety as being linked to fears, pain, suffering, something that will be difficult to implement, something that will be constraining. But at the same time, Madame Calvino, you talked about re-educating us in terms of values, like the value of what we consume. Maybe we have to change our vision to better savor the consumption that we have already and consider time and resources both as being scarce, and that it's important to better enjoy consuming as a way to change sobriety into something to better savor life's moments and to better count our blessings. Is this simple utopia? And what would the levers be to be able to drive this type of change in mindset, maybe through cinema or through... Is it through education? What's your view of this? Thank you very much. Should we take your question as well, a second question? Hello, Marie Fiejman, Adestra. I'd like to come back to social equity. Today, when you talk about frugality and the high cost, in northern countries today, it can be a much higher cost than sneakers. Well, for example, some the sneakers, Echo sneakers, can actually be much more expensive. Well, apparently they're cheaper than Nikes. So 90 euros is the first price. Okay, well, Patagonia, for example, the price. Sustainability does come at a cost. Whereas for alternative lifestyles. So there's also the global south. When you look at distribution of nutritional products today, well, you kind of need plastic to be able to enter into people's price range. Or for period underwear, well, these are also extremely expensive. So I would like to have your view. Have you seen any innovative models which would make it possible to make these products more affordable in North and South, to couple sobriety and social justice? Well, I live partly in Roubaix, so this is the third poorest city in France. In Roubaix, there's a lot of true poverty. There are 100,000 inhabitants, and there's a program called Zero Waste. Yes, you could say this is for middle classes, people who can be very careful about what they eat, but actually they carried out a study with about 200 families, and out of those, about 100 had median revenues of less than 800 euros per month. So their buying power is basically inexistent. But because they took part in the program just to learn how to cook and to manage their waste better, they were able to actually save between 400 and 500 euros per year, and that's huge. So saying, okay, organic, sustainability, etc., is only for the rich, I don't agree. In our association, we work with young people who have very little resources, but this doesn't prevent them to spend 200 euros buying crap, whereas they could have bought 3 t-shirts for 30 euros. And so you won't be able to change your shirt every day. Okay, then there's self-image, people's status. But really, I mean, my grandmother was born in 1914, and everything was organic back then. So the fact that organic produce is only for rich people is, I think, beside the point. I no longer go to supermarkets. I hate supermarkets, and they drive me nuts. Everything is... I get panic attacks when I go to malls. I prefer small local shops. And you can say again, oh no, that's only for rich people. No, that's not true. It depends on what you buy and what you eat. If you have 5 meals a day, yes, that will cost a lot. But if you go to markets and young people, we organize workshops around fashion, but we also ask people, what do you eat every day? How do you feed yourself? And it's a question of education once again. Saying organic produce, well, the marketing here, the very successful. The agri-food industry really succeeded on that one. But eating organic tomatoes in December, well, that doesn't exist. That's not organic. Fruits and vegetables only grow in certain seasons. But it's all about education once again, the knowing what to buy, what to eat. Maybe less, but better. And this isn't just for rich people. Because I live alongside the people who have very little means. And the taste of the products that we eat, well, that entails going to see the producer, meeting people, going onto the markets, rather than going to this huge supermarkets where you have no idea where the produce comes from. And this is a question of education, not money. Xavier? Yes, thank you. I wanted to... Yeah, there was also the question on representation. I don't want to forget that question. Well, the two kind of come together. So there's the question, okay, what do we do? How do we go about it? What direction should we go in? Back to nature, traditional recipes, degrowth. These are all part of the solution, but we have to be able to represent a model to strive towards. I've been looking at urban planning. I work a lot in the transport sector, and you see in urban planning, I think for the past 30 years, that what's good is density. And that cities should be dense. Okay, it's a bit of a caricature, but it's pretty much the discourse you hear. And above and beyond this, there's absolutely no model at world level of a city that works. We don't actually know what it is we need, and I think we should take the time to test things out, functionally speaking, to be able to have a model to base ourselves on, and then how to ensure that it's adopted. Because you can aspire to something. Some people might hate it. They might also say it's for the urban privileged people. But we have to look at how societies work and what choices people make. If you tell an individual that something's going to be 30% more expensive, well, who knows how they'll choose. But of course, an industry will be looking at all of these costs in a lot of detail. And I don't think an eco-tax would be a good idea, but rather a tax on other people just watching people online, somebody living in a house, taking a bath, whatever, rather than taxing people's fuel for their cars. I think we should put taxes on people's behavior, but what is possible and not. So greening industry or culture, what are you going to promote? Well, the choices are going to be difficult. And then with individuals, same thing. In our lab, we have researchers working on mobility in Africa, especially in large cities, which are very dense. Huge human density. And it's impossible to drive anywhere, but everybody wants a car. And as soon as an individual has enough means, they will buy a car and spend all their time in traffic jams. And even though a bike would serve them much, much better, that's not what they're going to buy. So we have to be able to change people's mindsets. But you can't just decide on education. But now coming back to the stages I talked about earlier, we have to give individuals the capacity to act. I would like to come back to social matters. And this goes, when we talk about chosen sobriety or sobriety that's imposed on you, this is giving a voice to people who are in a situation of sobriety, but it's usually seen negatively. These are people who don't have enough means to heat their houses or who have houses that are badly insulated. But I went to a Emmaüs convention a few years ago, people living in Emmaüs communities, most of them from abroad, because within the Emmaüs movement, most of the people come from elsewhere. And they come often from Africa, but also from Asia, who come from societies where they don't have the same means as we have in France. And what was very interesting is that it was a multicultural debate where it was possible to see that the definition of a waste changes from one society to the next, and the definition of what comfort is or the right to well-being, because the IPCC definition talked about well-being for all, but speaking with people who are saving on heating or on water, eating better, there wasn't immediate consensus. When you come, if you've been through a lot of difficulties and you come from a society where you didn't have electricity, you didn't have enough to eat every day, you're going to want to have meat and leave the lights on and leave the water on. And so the debate was around how can we have a collective project but all improve our well-being. So to come back to the question around social equity, our discourse and our representations of sobriety are unfortunately oriented towards a simplification of the complex actions of society. And in the debates we have, I think it's important to give voice to those who might say, I don't want to try to implement sobriety, and this is why. We have to ask very basic questions around what well-being is if we want social equity in our collective choices. Because often the debate is much too abstract or seen too positively, whereas in fact, and what was also very interesting as to what you said about your grandmother, I can't remember. In a way, and there is a young woman from Cameroon. She was an engineer, and the only job she could find was sorting through waste. So it's important to give a voice to those who know what sobriety is and who could help us to talk about it better. I don't think... today people talk about those who have to shoulder the burden of sobriety, and I think we have to complexify our vision. And we need people who do help us understand what sobriety is on a daily basis. Yes, I think you're perfectly right. And I think people have to be interested in life at all levels. So here I'm not speaking as somebody from Veolia, I'm just speaking as an individual and a member of an association in the Pleine Commune territory. And this is like the situation you described for Roubaix. The poverty level is twice as high there than as the French average. And the young people below 30 is also twice the French average. So it's important to organize workshops in hall, in the building lobbies, plant seeds here and there, but it's important to talk to people, because when you have people from a whole bunch of different countries, it is possible to see things a bit differently, and there are always good ideas and solutions that come up. You talked about period protection. So why get ones that are recyclable? I mean, in some neighborhoods, I had a young businesswoman. I helped her set up her business around this specific topic. But she's no richer than others, far cry from it, but it's an idea that she developed. And you just need to be able to create ties with other individuals. The policies implemented in this area, and then to make use of it and to find the right connections. And I think it's by making connections that we'll be able to think about things differently and hopefully find a different way of consuming. I just wanted to add that I encourage you all to read in the editorial in the facts pamphlet by the member of the perspective of the Foresight Committee, so the foreword on sobriety, on circularity as an African tradition, who calls upon all of us to think about sobriety in terms of these local societies. It's not just degrowth. So the foreword by Mampela Rampele. You don't have to read everything, but do read that. And yes, I also encourage you to read several articles in this pamphlet. And so there's the example of Le Bon Coin, so an online sales platform. So I believe Le Bon Coin is a good example of intersection between the circular economy and the universality, rather than using the word inclusion, which I don't like very much. So this is a website that's about 15 years old. Originally, it was for secondhand goods, and then bit by bit, it now has 30 million single users per month. And it pretty much mirrors French society. So it's a truly universal brand. There are very few brands that have managed to... It's basically the BIC for swaps. Everybody uses it. And this, it started out as people just trying to get by, but it has now become more than that. It has been ennobled. Much wealthier people have also started using it, and so it now has become a majority consumption means. And it's also interesting to see how fringe practices can become mainstream. And now I'm coming out of my role as a facilitator, just to draw your attention to the fact there are no policy interventions. Nobody said, okay, we should change society's imagination. Just organically, little by little, 30 million French people take the time to build something, and which then becomes a majority norm. And I think this is an example that could help us see how something a certain practice can become part of our daily lives. And I think we really... So this is me moving away from my role as moderator. Yeah, that's an excellent example. I completely agree. And this is just one example, but there are social phenomena that are happening all the time. But a lot of them going in the other direction. So how do we create a social model? To answer the question earlier of how do we model ourselves on nature better, there is no magic recipe. I think we have to base ourselves on our intuition. And these are things we need. And Le Bon Coin, well, it was something that was needed. I went to Détroit a few years ago because I wanted to see the state of the city, because it had been described in the press that it had gone bankrupt and that it was, well, bouncing back. And so I wanted to see what a devastated city was like. But there's no more electricity in the streets. Pretty much everything is abandoned. The houses are empty. But the people who have stayed, who weren't able to leave, have remodeled the city. There's no longer any food in the supermarkets, so they've had to create something, and they did it out of a survival instinct. So they recreated small collectives, they grow food, they sell it to each other, and they manage to continue living. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank you for this round table, and in particular for the example of the pedestrian crossing, which provides hope for... Yeah, because, well, young bourgeois inhabitants are already wearing Patagonia, and they can give an example and that other people follow. With less consumption, secondhand clothes. And I think that by replacing the three-piece suit with Vigas, and I think we can really start a more vast movement. But joking aside, I think an important question that you're raising here, and I'm Claire Tutenier, EPE, Enterprise for the Environment. It's a question of defining well-being for all. Because I wanted to say that there are no limits. I mean, well-being for all means having more stuff or having gone on vacation to a place where nobody else has gone. Because right now people believe that well-being for all means being able to consume more than your friends or your neighbors. So I think we need to think about this very closely. And even amongst poorer people, their idea is still consumption. Okay, going to Burger King or going something else, but it's still all about consumption. So I'm surprised you didn't talk about the SDGs, because they have their own definition of well-being for all. There are upper limits and lower limits. The SDGs, well, there are a lot of people that never go on vacation. There's a question of decent work. Mobility isn't necessary to everybody's well-being. And the poorest people in France and in Europe, well, it's important to realize what their vital minimum is. I would have been interesting to hear your thoughts on this, because this goes very deeply into representation of what well-being actually is, including in our own civilizations. And I also wanted to come back to this idea of growth. The Social and Environmental Council will soon be publishing an analysis of the controversies around the ecological transformation and whether that's compatible with growth. It doesn't decide the question, but there's a lot of resistance around this idea and whether degrowth is viable. Thank you very much. I think there's some questions online. Yep, so I'll just read them out and then you can answer them. And we will have 1.5 minutes to answer them all. Okay, so what economic model are coming out? Billing for per cubic meter in water, for example. Another question. EDF. Can't we see sobriety rather as a tool, just like efficiency, saying that robustness or resilience is the goal? And the third question around digital sobriety. This is also very important given huge consumption in this area. So how can we ensure digital sobriety? And we also had the question around SDGs. And then if you take the floor, if you could also just give us a word of conclusion. Well, starting with SDGs, indeed, mobility isn't in it explicitly, but there's a lot around production methods. And the SDGs are also going to be revised soon. And the circular economy standards propose actions to be implemented to contribute to SDGs, generally speaking. So that was very briefly. And then on the question of a billing in terms of volume as opposed to in terms of performance, this is a question that comes back constantly. It's been years now, but it's true. You're right. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about how you can integrate performance, operational performance, environmental performance, social performance into a model that doesn't currently take all of this into account. And how. So there are a variety of means. I was talking about a different type of accounting. And we will be carrying out trials. But this is something which requires completely overhauling our economic models and to adopting something completely different. So it will be highly complex, but these are things we're thinking about at Veolia. And digital sobriety, well, I'm not very well placed to talk about it, but it's like the circular economy models. Well, we have to think about design, about why we do what we do. Do we actually need something or not? How can we optimize all of the consumption resource processes? So it's a very broad answer, but it's certainly not by accumulating products and technologies without thinking about their true contribution as compared to older technologies. So I don't have much to answer that, but this last sentence makes me think about the roles of public powers and public policy, because they don't seem to be there to upend the status quo. People want to maintain what already exists, but still trigger change. So that's a little bit contradictory. So that was my way of conclusion. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe you could answer a few questions or give a quick conclusion. We're slightly over time-wise, so just maybe a conclusion or an answer. All right. I know what I said, but I believe in humanity. I think we'll get on the right track eventually. We were saying this morning. Very few people are aware of these issues. We're amongst ourselves, we all know what's going on, but when you talk to someone in a street, we're not there yet. There's a long way to go. Digital sobriety, for low-tech approach, you think of a usage of technology before you acquire the technology. That's very helpful. It's linked to us joining this cultural battle. As Claire was saying, this matter of degrowth. I like this idea of thinking of acting. I went to a degrowth festival organized by Delphine Bateau. She's been working on these issues for a few years now. So these are huge festivals where 2,000 people go. They're not haunted by this idea of degrowth. It's actually people who are thinking about growth over time, the idea of growth over a long, long term. So what's going to happen in the future? Nowadays, it's difficult to put ourselves in this place, to project ourselves in this future way of doing things, whilst being convinced it's going to lead to an improvement of how we live. So we need more imagination when we think of a future. I think that the IPCC's statement ought to be completed like this. Well-being in the future is not something where good well-being has no limits. Thank you. Thank you to you four. Now let's stop here, thinking of acting, hoping that this conference allowed you to think about matters of sobriety, and that it's encouraged you to act. So thank you. Thank you for coming here, and I hope you enjoy lunch. Thank you.